When Mussolini came to power in Italy in 1922, he promised to modernize the country. The motor car offered the perfect symbol of modernization. With the development of Italian cars, he would put Italy in the front rank of advanced countries. He called on Italy's motor companies to help create his vision of a car-owning society. At the Lingotto factory in Turin, the Fiat company started to mass-produce cheap cars. From the ground floor, the production line wound upwards inside the building. Out at the top came the finished cars to be tested on the roof on a specially built track. The Italian flair for design and a love of the motor car produced some beautiful and practical vehicles. Fiat prospered. In the 1920s, there was no better way of popularizing these newly produced motor cars than to race them on public roads. Italy was already the home of one great road race, the Targa Florio. It was an enormously popular event in Sicily. It had been the idea of a wealthy Palermo merchant, Count Vincenzo Florio, and was first held in 1906. But the Targa Florio was run in the barely populated mountains of Sicily. What was needed was a race in the more populous north of the country. The answer was the Mille Miglia, the 1,000 miles that became the classic road race of all time.
The Mille Miglia started in 1927. It was an idea of 4 friends of mine. It was Count Magic and Mazzotti, Castagneto and Canestrini. They decided to make one race. It should have been only one, because it was a real madness. And then Mussolini sent a cable the next day saying, "Si ripeta," it means, do it again.
Hundreds of thousands of people had turned out to see the cars as they raced along the roads of northern Italy. So the Mille Miglia became an annual event. The Mille Miglia was open to amateurs and professionals. By the 1950s, hundreds of drivers were taking part, the humblest of saloons competing against the latest racing sports models.
Mia moglie dice, ci vengo anch'io.
My wife said, I'm coming too, so you won't do anything stupid. So we set off. At the beginning, my wife was terrified, because to go off in this car, even though it was a Fiat 500 and didn't go very fast, but with your foot right down on the accelerator all the time, and we had hopes.
E poi avevamo anche delle speranze. Ogni tanto mia moglie...
Every now and again my wife looked behind us saying, no one's catching up with us. I looked ahead instead and said, but we're not catching up with anyone.
Non acchiappiamo nessuno.
And the Italians are funny people. They were mad about motor racing. So they'd put up signposts to warn you that there was a dangerous place. But of course, by the time you got there in the race, the crowd had all pulled the signposts down, thrown them into a field somewhere, and when you got there, they'd all become waving you on like mad, and you think, well, I must be going rather slowly, and you go barreling over the top of the hill, and suddenly find the road disappear to the right, and people go end over end into sort of fields and catch fire, and the crowd loved it, but it wasn't, just the ideal sort of thing for a driver.
The reputation of the Mille Miglia grew outside Italy. In 1955, Mercedes-Benz entered a team of 300 SLR racing sports cars with a strong team of drivers.
We wanted to win Mille Miglia for the reputation we would get in Italy. We wanted to sell cars there. So we practiced a lot. I drove around several times. I liked it very much. It was fun. Fangio hated it because he couldn't drive at top speed down the road, which seemed to be blocked by onlookers, fans who hated that. Stirling Moss didn't seem to care. And Stirling Moss said, I can't remember the whole road. I'm going to have a co-driver with Jenkinson.
Jenks and I decided the only way to go fast on this road was to take everything that we thought could be a hazard. In other words, blind brows when we didn't know what they were, corners you couldn't see around, things like that, and give a signal. Jenks would give me a signal like that means flat out, that's slow, that's much slower, that's the right, you know. And so we put these all these notes down on a piece of paper about 20 metres long, and then he ran this thing in front of him. We'd come over a brow at very high speed, he'd just say flat out. And of course the Italians, they'd all lean to see down the road, you know, and so you're driving at a funnel of people like that. I mean, you know, these speeds is I mean, I just waggle the steering a bit so things like this, the people say, Christ, he's out of control, and pull out of the way. I mean, I remember going along a fast, straight piece of road with a twin-engined aircraft. Well, now they do 140 miles an hour in those days, and we were just overhauling this thing and pulling away. I mean, it was quite a staggering sort of event.
Stirling Moss won the race for Mercedes, breaking the record in spectacular fashion.
The Miglia, the year that I won it, which was an average of 98.98 miles an hour, took 10 hours, 7 minutes, 4 seconds, I think, or maybe 4 minutes, 7 seconds. I forget which it was, but it luckily can't be beaten now.
It can't be beaten because the Miglia was banned 2 years later. It had been a dangerous race for some time, but it took a tragedy to end it, an accident involving the Spanish driver, Alfonso de Portago.
In 1957, De Portago pinched a tire at Mantua on a curb, so that the front wheel exploded while he was driving at 120 miles per hour. And then there were about 10 or 15 people who were killed. And then the thing that was a madness itself, and that had been repeated 24 times, a miracle, had to be stopped.
Road racing on the scale of the Miglia had become just too dangerous. In Britain, road racing had never been allowed on the mainland, but in Northern Ireland during the 1950s, a circuit of public roads at Dundrod was used for the tourist trophy.
Well, I think Dundrod was the most dangerous circuit I've ever raced on. It was narrow, the cambers were all wrong, it's the part of Ireland where it's continuously raining. The surface wasn't that good. I got a pit signal to come in earlier than I should, and I was so delighted and I was so happy. I couldn't wait to get to the pits, and in the process I lost it going over one of the bridges there and wrote the car off completely. That's the only time I've ever shunted and damaged an Aston Martin. A lot of drivers killed there, 3 in one race, one of the TTs. They should never have allowed motor racing there, and today they wouldn't be allowed to run a race there.
Fortunately, no spectators were killed, but the deaths of 3 drivers showed how dangerous it was to race powerful cars on ordinary roads. In spite of the danger, the 1955 race between Stirling Moss for Mercedes and Mike Hawthorne for Jaguar showed why spectators loved it.
Mike Hawthorne was a great character. I mean, he was an extrovert, a tremendous personality, larger than life, a boy's own type character, you know, of how a racing driver should be. A shock of blonde hair, always wore a bow tie and usually a flat cap with a sort of a bit of a V in the peak. The opposite of Stirling, really, in his approach to motorsport, and he would see nothing unusual about having a pint of beer the night before the race, whereas Stirling would be very abstemious and be thoroughly prepared physically and mentally for the race.
The Tourist Trophy, as part of the World Sports Car Championship, was an important race to win. Mike Hawthorne went into the lead at the start, with Stirling Moss lying third.
I'd won, I think, I don't know, 3 or 4 tourist trophies, and I wanted to win that very much. The Dundrod circuit was a very demanding circuit, quite narrow, and Mercedes was quite a big car, potential certainly of winning it. The great thing about the Mercedes was, quite honestly, unless you went off the road, you could win or be second to Fangio, because the cars were that reliable. I mean, we did not have any trouble with the SLRs at all.
Each car had two drivers. When Mike Hawthorne came into the pits for a routine handover, Moss opened up a substantial lead before coming into the pits himself.
I'm going along and suddenly a tread peeled. Now, very rare thing that treads used to peel right off like a banana. I'd never had it before on the Mercedes. Anyway, that ripped off the back wing. We had to go in and waste some time on that.
Replacing the wheel cost Moss 2 minutes, and while the Mercedes was in the pits, Jaguar took the lead again. It was a gripping race. As the lead continued to change, the result was uncertain. Then it rained. Moss's skill at driving in the wet was a deciding factor.
Dundrod's one of my favourite circuits because of the sort of circuit it is. It's demanding, it is a bit dangerous, it is always wet there, which I don't particularly like that much, but it is. But it is the sort of circuit that I can sort of cope with. It was a good circuit for Mercedes, for myself, and the 55 TT was very important to me.
Moss won the race and would go on to win the Targa Florio in Sicily and the 1955 World Sports Car Championship for Mercedes. But the deaths that year put an end to racing at Dundrod. The age of the epic road races was drawing to a close. More and more were being banned because of the increasing danger to drivers and spectators alike. The oldest race was the last to go. After nearly 70 years, the final Targa Florio was held, severing the only remaining link with the heroic age of motor racing. To the end, it produced heroes for the Italian fans, drivers like Nino Vaccarella, a Palermo schoolteacher who won it twice for Ferrari. In 1973, the Targa Florio had finished in triumphant style. 750,000 people had turned out to see the last race. Today, the grandstand lies empty. The Targa Florio has passed into motor racing history. The great road races have gone, but one branch of the sport has outlived them all: hill climbing. In England, at Shelsley Walsh, Worcestershire, drivers have been competing since 1905. At Prescott, not far away, they also keep the tradition alive. In hill climbing, the drivers are on the road alone, pitting their cars against the hill and the clock. Many of the cars are veterans of other, more exalted forms of racing, enjoying a second career in hill climbing.
Time for camera 79.63.86.
For some drivers, hill climbing was a good place to start a career in racing.
I went to Prescott, and my first event there, actually, I think I was third, which I was pretty happy about. I mean, I'd never driven anything in a competition before. I can remember just thinking, well, on the line, and you're like this, and then the flag fell, and you've got the first thing you're concentrating on is a good getaway, because in a hill climb it really matters. You've got to get not too much wheel spin, virtually none, go away, and then I think, well, I'll brake as late as I can. That's about all, and I'll steer here and there, but nothing more than that. I learnt an enormous amount from two things, I think, at the very beginning. One was the Cooper, obviously, because it was a forgiving car, a good car, a responsive type of car, and B, from hill climbs. I think hill climbs are a very good place for people to start, because on a hill climb there's nobody else to try and make you do something that perhaps you haven't the capabilities of doing. In other words, if you're going in a race and a car comes past, you think, gosh, I'm as quick as he is, and you try and follow him when maybe the guy who passed you was a latent Fangio. You don't know this. And going in a hill climb, you go into a corner and you drive it as you see it. You brake when you want to brake. There's nobody sort of suggesting you can go quicker or more slowly or whatever. And you use the road as much as you want and so on. And so I think it's a very good place for people who are starting to cut their teeth.
The hill at Prescott is almost 3/4 of a mile long, and even novices manage to get up it in under a minute. In the United States, there's a hill climb which puts most of the others in the shade. Pikes Peak in Colorado.
14,000 feet of challenging snow-capped rock. Along sheer walls and high stone cliffs, a steep and winding roadway has been blasted into the mountaintop. Here is a natural testing ground, and what a testing ground. And they're off. Hammett is over the mark first, closely followed by Cimino, and then by Schultz. Oh, look at those boys dig in on the turn.
The first Race to the Clouds was run in 1916. The climb winds 12 miles to the mountain summit, over 14,000 feet above sea level. Pikes Peak has been called Unser's Mountain, after one of America's great racing families, the Unsers, who've raced there for 3 generations.
I've driven in all of the races up here except one since 1926. I've won the race 9 times, and I think I've had more fun up here than anybody that's ever been on this hill.
The family's long association with Pikes Peak gave Louis's nephew, Bobby Unser, an intimate knowledge of the road.
I know the road so well. I know practically every turn and every little rock that there is up here at Pikes Peak. In fact, I can lay in bed at night and go over every turn, every straightaway, everything that there is up here, and I think that helps tremendously.
The driving technique has been passed on to Bobby's son, Robbie Unser.
The condition of the road, it's a loose granite gravel that's very slippery, and you have a hard time getting side bite and forward bite with the car. And it's one of those deals, you never stop sliding. You're kind of careful. You know, I mean, Pikes Peak, you've got to find the limits, but you can't go over them. It's a place that you race against yourself. It's not a race against another car. You don't have to pass another guy. You don't have to set him up or, you know, race him. It's you and the mountain, and it's time. So you got to be a very disciplined driver and a very smooth driver in order to be successful up here.
In the 1980s, there was a challenge to the American domination of Pikes Peak. Champion rally drivers from Europe arrived with cars specially built to go fast on rough terrain. The French company Peugeot prepared their car with 4-wheel drive and 4-wheel steering for the mountain. As he set out to break the record, the Finnish driver Ari Vatanen faced treacherous conditions towards the summit.
Very difficult to describe to an outsider, because to an outsider you're a bit of a lunatic to do it, but once you are in a sport and you feel you're on top of it, it's great. 120-kilometer thrust to the 14,000 feet with no barriers, with really deep drops occasionally, and the car is very, very fast. I mean, about the same speed as Formula 1 car. And it's all or nothing. There's no space for error at all. And if you miss your one braking or you brake too early, you know that you are hardly likely to win it.
In 1988, Ari Vatanen broke the record in the Race to the Clouds at an average speed of 70 miles an hour. As well as creating one of the highest hill climbs, America also produced one of the longest road races. As in Britain, road racing has never been allowed in the United States. Then in 1950, an opportunity for American drivers occurred right on their own doorstep in Mexico. The Mexican section of the Pan American Highway from Alaska to Cape Horn was finished that year. To celebrate, the Mexican government allowed a road race from one end of the country to the other. The Carrera Panamericana soon captured the imagination of drivers and public.
The drivers did best that were very good at high-speed driving on the roads and could visually size up a situation and get through it. You never got a chance to really learn the road like you can the Targa Florio or the Nürburgring. As long as they are, you can at least learn those circuits well. And in this, you could learn pieces of it, like from the Puebla to Mexico City, you could learn that like the back of your hand. But the whole length of it, you just really could not get to know it that well, that you could be sure that you weren't going to goof up somewhere.
Like the Mille Miglia and the Targa Florio, it was immensely popular with spectators. They turned out in their thousands along the route. And like the Mille Miglia, the enthusiasm of the spectators to get near the cars put an end to it. In 1954, after 5 races and many casualties, the Mexican government banned it. Denied the opportunity to race on the roads, American enthusiasts looked to their big open spaces instead. In the 1960s, a new form of off-road racing was conceived down the Baja Peninsula in Mexico. One of its stars was a driver who had attempted the land speed record, Mickey Thompson. The Baja races are run over hundreds of miles of the roughest terrain ever used for motor competitions. The cars are specially built for the desert conditions.
The car's in good shape now, though. All right, how much gas are putting in? 40 gallons. Taking off 40 gallons? Yeah, taking all of it. Oil's good. You're ready to go. All right, here.
It was fun to drive and exciting to watch, but only the hardiest of spectators made it far down the route.
We ran a race and I was co-driving with my dad. At the time I wasn't allowed to drive, but I could ride with him, which was absolutely scary, I'm here to tell you. As he's driving the race car, I'm going, it's incredible, you can't believe what he just did. And from that point on, my dad started saying, we have to have people see this. Because in the middle of Baja, you're at a disadvantage for letting anybody see, because the only people that are out there are a few locals, and you got a lot of snakes, rabbits, and that's about it. Some birds. Nobody can see it. So my dad's saying right then, we got to have people see this. We've got to have people see this. And there it is. The rest of the race, that's all he kept saying. He had absolutely lost concentration on racing because he came up with a new revolutionary idea.
That idea was to bring Baja racing into the Los Angeles Olympic Stadium. His approach was direct.
Hi, my name's Mickey Thompson. I have this great idea. I want to take your beautiful field down there where those Olympics have been held, and I want to bring put plastic over your field, Then I want to bring 1,100 sheets of plywood and put plywood over your field. Then I'm going to bring 25 million pounds of dirt in here, and I'm going to make jumps and bumps, and I'm going to create my own chunk of Baja. And then down there on the one end of the Coliseum, I want to run the race cars right up through the bleachers, around your famous Olympic torch, and back into the stadium floor. And then I'm going to put 60,000 people in here to watch it. I mean, this guy, he's staggered, you know, he's going, wow, this is impossible.
But Mickey Thompson did it, and a new form of racing was born. It was a long way from the tradition of the great road races, but it was competitive and fun for the drivers. It was safe, and above all, it was tailor-made for the spectators.
The average person's attention span is between 7 and 10 minutes. So rather than have a race that's 3 or 4 hours long where people get bored and get up, my dad made every race be 7 to 10 minutes. Then people can get up, they can get their peanuts, their hot dogs, their beers, whatever they want, and you have another race in 3 to 4 minutes after that. So the way our format works right now for the Mickey Thompson Entertainment Group is we have 18 separate races in a 3-hour period. We've never had anybody seriously hurt. The cars go upside down, and unlike other forms of racing where usually when you go upside down it's an absolute tragedy, our cars are actually built to go upside down. So when they go upside down, there's about 6 or 7 force workers that run out there, they roll the cars back over. A lot of times you don't even shut the engines off, and you go right back out and race again. So that's what makes it so exciting. This is a no-holds-barred, go-for-it type of sport. Now it's one of the most popular forms of racing there is in the United States.
The men who competed in the Mille Miglia would scarcely see the connection between their achievements and Mickey Thompson's circus. But for the spectators in the Los Angeles Olympic Stadium and those who once lined the route of the Targa Florio, the excitement remains the same. In just 20 remarkable years at the turn of the century, racing cars were transformed from unreliable bone shakers into thoroughbreds like these. From the start, motor racing created great public interest. For many, it was a rare chance to see a motor car in action. Primitive roads and high speeds offered thrills and danger. Motorsports pioneers often paid for their passion with their deaths. Danger, though, was no deterrent to the men who built and drove those early racing cars. They were intoxicated by the excitement and the challenge of the new sport. It forced the pace of technology. It made car makers household names. It brought glory to the winners. That was why they took up motor racing, and those reasons still hold good today. The petrol engine motor car was invented in Germany in 1885, but it was the French who took this horseless carriage to their hearts. France had a tradition in such vehicles. 20 years earlier, Etienne Lenoir had unveiled the world's first motor car with an internal combustion engine. Now, French engineers set out to improve the German invention. Their early engines were effective if a little crude. It's brutal, but it goes, was how France's pioneer Émile Leverson described his car. Competition wasn't long in coming. In 1894, a French newspaper sponsored a Paris to Rouen motor trial. 13 petrol and 8 steam cars took part. The top prize of 5,000 francs was won jointly by the two great pioneering companies who made petrol cars, Peugeot and Panin et Leverson. The 79-mile journey took almost 7 hours to complete. The winning car averaged about 10 miles an hour. Generally, the reliability of the cars was impressive. 17 of the 21 cars reached Rouen, and only one petrol car failed to finish. A year later, the newly formed Auto Club of France organized a full-scale race from Paris to Bordeaux and back, 732 miles. Émile Leverson was first home, after driving 48 grueling hours single-handed in his Panhard. This success brought a spate of epic city-to-city races: Paris to Amsterdam, Paris to Vienna, Paris to Berlin. The drivers had to endure every kind of discomfort and danger in open cars with no windscreen or mudguards. Their heroic achievements gave motoring a tremendous boost and made a strong impression on one of the first motoring correspondents, W.F. Bradley.
It inspired the people. It gave them confidence in the car. Instead of running a car on a track where it'd be nothing much better than a whirling gigs, they went from place to place. It's inspiration to think that a car could go from Paris down to Marseille practically without a stop. It was wonderful. First of all, there was the start of the cars at 1 minute intervals. That was thrilling to see them go away individually, knowing that they were aiming for another country. And then on the road too, there was a fight between the individual drivers. And it was really thrilling and dangerous. The man was always driving, the man who was following was always driving in a cloud of dust, waiting for an opportunity to get through that dust and press the car ahead of him, not knowing what there may be ahead of him, because he couldn't see the road. That was really dangerous. And that was the direct cause of most of the accidents. There was always something happening, because the driver and the mechanic had to do everything, and there was always a certain amount of work to be done on cars, and they added to the interest of the race.
The rough roads, the fierce competition, the car's untested engineering all resulted in constant breakdowns and running repairs. A riding mechanic was essential if a car was to have any hope of finishing. With sometimes only a toolbox or a seat, the mechanic had a tough and dangerous job.
The poor racing mechanic received no plaudits from the public or from the press as they should have, because without them it was impossible to win. They died more frequently because they didn't have anything to hold on to. At least the steering wheel gave you some protection and allowed you something to hold on to. The poor mechanic really could hold on to the gas cap, maybe, or a spare tire or something, but he really didn't have much to hold on to.
As cars got better, there was less need for a mechanic. But in some events for years to come, one was still carried. Among the last to face the horrors of the job was Wilkie Wilkinson.
I went in this race with Easton was in the fastest car in the race, but the driver and the mechanic had to do all the work. When the flare goes down at 8 o'clock in the morning, you run across the circuit and then jump in the car, get it started, and off you go. Now we have to fill it up with petrol tunes, 5 gallons a time. So before the race, I've made a big funnel that holds 5 gallons, so I could put it in and throw 5 gallons in, and then go and get the other churn while that was running in. But making this thing, I cut my hand very badly and got lead poison in it. So this was quite a tough job, with pumping the pressure up all the time. It had to be 2.5 pounds per square inch to bring the petrol up from the tank with carburetors. If you pumped too hard, the carburetors would flood, you see, and or go fluffy. If you didn't pump enough, the carburetors would starve and the engine would slow down. Well, we went part way through the race, it started thundering, lightning, and terrible race it was. Now, George Easton, he has all-in glasses all the time, so the pebbles of his racing glasses were the same. So I had a spare pair in my overall pocket and a chamois leather. And when he got on the straight, he said, change. I whipped his glasses off quickly, couldn't see properly, put the other ones on and cleaned the other ones ready for change. And my hand was terribly bad, and then the wretched thing started jumping out of gear. And he said, hold the bee thing in gear. So I had to hold my bad hand in the second gear. Unfortunately, the gearbox has got no cover on the side, so all of my flesh was on my inside of my foot was burnt off. On this side, the silencer was still leaking, and on the cockpit side, all my leg was burnt. And honestly, I was in such a state, I didn't care whether we won the race. It was broadside on because it was so wet and slippery. And finally, we finished 4th. And by this time, my hand was all swollen up. I had thread streaks up my arm and a ball underneath the arm. He looked at me, and we had a glass of champagne. He rushed me straight off to the hospital. And I had to stay there for 3 days to get the poison down. And when I got home to my wife, I hadn't been married very long, about 6 weeks, I had laryngitis, so I couldn't speak. So she looked at me, and as I was married in Lent, she said, "They will live to repent." Unfortunately, we didn't. We were still happy and really married at the end.
Whatever excitement the early cars caused on the continent, the British authorities were not amused. Road racing was banned altogether. In Britain, it was no longer necessary for someone carrying a red flag to walk 60 feet ahead of the car, but motorists had their speed restricted to 4 miles an hour in the country and 2 miles an hour in the towns and villages. In 1896, the law was changed and the speed limit was raised to 14 miles an hour. To mark the event, an emancipation run was organised from London to Brighton. The run is still celebrated every year. That first November morning, thousands of spectators turned out to watch some 30 cars set off, almost all of them French or German. At the head of the procession was the car in which Émile Levasseur had won his historic race the previous year. Also present to honour the event was one of the German inventors of the motor car, Gottlieb Daimler himself. Adding to the excitement were 4 Leon Bowley tricycles, an Arnold dog cart, a steam bicycle, and a breakdown van full of spares, most of which it ended up using itself. The journey exacted the usual toll on the participants. Some cars broke down and were loaded on a train at Brixton. Another overturned and catapulted its occupants into a pond. But at least 14 managed to complete the distance, reaching Brighton in time to take tea at the Metropole Hotel. Of course, the Emancipation Run was not a race. Only when the circuit at Brooklands was built 10 years later would drivers be allowed to race in mainland Britain. In the meantime, they had to compete in France, where the authorities were more helpful.
In France, the law was always very indulgent towards motorists. There were no restrictions in France. The speed depended on circumstances. In certain cases, 10 miles an hour would be criminal. In other cases, 100 miles an hour would be perfectly justifiable. And that was a spirit which prevailed.
With such encouragement, France was the undisputed home of motor racing. Its manufacturers took up racing to promote their cars with great success. In 1900, the Renault brothers built 179 machines in their new factory. After they won the Paris to Toulouse race, they received 350 more orders. Then came the disastrous Paris to Madrid race of 1903. It would be the last of the great marathons. Competition pushed everything, especially machinery, to breaking point. This certainly improved technology, but it also caused accidents. During the race, at least 5 drivers and mechanics were killed, as well as several spectators. So the authorities stopped the event at Bordeaux. The most famous casualty was one of the Renault brothers, Marcel. Blinded by dust, he'd missed a corner, crashed off the road, and been fatally injured under the weight of his car. Louis heard the news at Bordeaux and fainted. He never raced again. His riding mechanic, François Sitz, took over the job of racing the Renault cars. To replace the road races, in 1906, the Auto Club of France decided to create an event that would outshine all previous efforts, the first ever Grand Prix. It was a 12-lap race staged on a circuit of closed roads just outside Le Mans. 770 car-crunching miles.
Well, the people wanted the race to be held in their district. There were plenty of applicants for the race because they realized it added prestige to their town or their district, and it brought in money, and there were plenty of aspirants for the Grand Prix race. It's just to be remembered, these races were very, very costly, and they were not money makers at all. The organizers certainly lost money, and the only way to hold a race at all was to get the local authorities to subsidize the race, which they did to a very high degree.
34 cars entered the race, most of them French. It was held over 2 days with cars locked away during the night. The winner, after 12 hours of driving and 19 tyre changes, was Sitz in a Renault. The top speed of the Renault which won the first Grand Prix was just over 90 miles an hour, 4 times that of a decade earlier. This had been achieved almost entirely by increasing the size of the engine. By 1908, the racing car had grown into a monster. Britain's leading car at the time was the Napier.
It's a 6-cylinder engine. The cylinders are in 3 blocks of 2, and at 11.5 litres, you will appreciate, is knocking on 2 litres a cylinder, which is the size of a fair-sized family car today. It wouldn't be easy to steal. The cold start, I think I remember, needs something like 14 separate steps. And it also, I think, would be no good to anybody weighing less than about 12 stone, because part of the starting technique is to go around and stand on the starting handle and just push it over 1 or 2 compressions. Now, as you'll appreciate, the compressions on a 2-litre cylinder can be quite strong, and on a very cold morning you can stand up there admiring the scenery for a long time. And then you get this magic trick, which of course you can only perform with a 6-cylinder, that you just switch on the trembler coil and it starts. No starter, no heaving on the starting handle, it just goes. And you need to be quite sneaky to surprise it into gear. But again, once you're in gear, you can just keep going all day. It just handles so beautifully. You would think, looking at it, that it would be nose heavy and it would be difficult to handle. In fact, it's an absolute dream on the circuit. And the amazing thing is that in the wet, when of course you can't stop it because the brakes don't work, you can take curves in a most elegant, long four-wheel drift under total control.
The surface was pretty awful, and so they had to put up with bumping and bouncing about. The driver always carried a mechanic with him, and apparently his main task, apart from pumping up the fuel, was any roadside repairs, but in particular changing tyres, because tyre technology was very basic then. They used to literally, they had a puncture, cut the tyre off with a knife, and they carried 2 or 3 spare tyres on the back, and they fitted them with levers. But by 1908, all the cars, in fact, had detachable rims, so it was almost like just changing a wheel, but they still had a lot of trouble.
If it's raining, of course, you really get everything. There's often no mud guards, so you get all the rain and so on in your face. And it corners better than you might imagine. There's a danger if you go too fast and it grips too much and digs in, it could actually topple over. This actually happened with a Renault Grand Prix car in the 07 Grand Prix, which made a corner and then simply toppled over onto its side, throwing the driver and mechanic off.
As cars improved, drivers looked for bigger challenges. In 1902, an Englishman, E.E. Lewis, tried to drive his Panhard round the world. He got as far as St. Petersburg. Then came the most ambitious of all long-distance events. In 1907, the French newspaper Le Matin sponsored a race from Peking to Paris. Five men picked up the challenge. One was the Italian Prince Scipio Borghese in a new Itala car. He took along his chauffeur and a journalist. It was a journey of Homeric proportions, 9,500 miles. The roads were primitive, the weather harsh. They crossed deserts and tundra. They forded rivers. They drove over mountains. They were always getting stuck, in the mud, in the slime, in the sand. Time and again, they had to get the astonished locals to push or to pull or raise their Itala out of difficulty or rescue them from possible disaster. They struggled through China, Mongolia, Siberia, Russia, and northern Europe. Exactly 2 months after leaving Peking, the Count arrived triumphantly in Paris. It was 3.5 weeks before any of the others turned up. 1912 saw the last of the big-engine racing cars, the Fiat S74 from Italy.
The S74 Fiat is probably the epitome of development of the large-bore model race car. The car has a 14.5-liter engine, which is equivalent to 850 cubic inches approximately. It's a huge engine. One of the reasons when they raced these Fiats in the Grand Prix races, they never turned them off when they came into the pits, was the plugs would oil up and they couldn't restart them easily. So they left them running, which made it a rather dangerous situation when they were gassing up. And there's a feeling in that car that you'll never get in a modern race car with high RPM. It has a very low-end torque, and it pulls you back in the seat, and it's a tremendous feeling. Many historians, much to my chagrin, talk about the fact that these are dinosaurs. But indeed, they were the epitome of development of that time, and only through change in formula did they become obsolete. They did not become obsolete because they were not effective race cars. This car was clocked at the Grand Prix in 1912 in France at over 100 miles an hour. It was capable of over 120 miles an hour and had a tremendous acceleration.
In the march of science, bigger is not always better. Now, an engineering revolution would silence the thunder of the Fiat's slow-moving pistons. The breakthrough was this, the double overhead camshaft engine. Its radical design offered more power from a smaller engine and dictated the shape of racing cars for years to come. Its designer was Ernest Henry, a shy Swiss who was employed by Peugeot. He had an exceptional talent for converting ideas into detailed working drawings.
Henry designed the first Peugeot Grand Prix engine for the Grand Prix of 1912, and also the following engines for 13 and 14. He brought together existing techniques to build an engine which is very much, I would say, the forerunner of all modern Grand Prix engines.
Henry's original drawings illustrate his revolutionary concept, 2 overhead camshafts with 4 inclined valves for each of the 4 cylinders. Where the Fiat's massive engine produced 1,600 revs per minute, the Peugeot, with an engine half the size, achieved 2,200. More power for less size, the goal of every successful racing engine. The battle between the new and the old was fought out at the 1912 Grand Prix in Dieppe. The big Fiats were favourites, and one led for most of the 2-day race. But Georges Boileau, in his light and low Peugeot, held on to second place. Then the leading Fiat hit a dog and had to retire. So Peugeot won the Grand Prix and went on to dominate the racing circuits of Europe and America. Georges Boileau had won a crucial, if lucky, victory for Henry's new engine. Ernest Henry's designs created the modern racing car, but his introvert personality meant his efforts were overshadowed by others. He died in obscurity, a drifter according to one historian. His real contribution to racing technology has only recently been recognized.
Toute sa vie, il était passionné de moteurs, de voitures.
All his life he was passionate about engines and about cars. It was an illness with him, like being an architect, or making boats or planes. He specialized in designing engines. He was always making engines.
Peugeot's winning cars pointed the way forward. Soon other car makers were copying their engines and improving their designs. In Britain, both Sunbeam and Humber built cars with twin overhead camshaft engines based on Henry's work. So did the Germans and the Italians. As war approached, technical and sporting rivalry between companies took on a political edge. The showdown was to take place at the Grand Prix in Lyon in France on July the 5th, 1914. The company which had made the biggest preparations for the event was Daimler-Benz of Germany. Their formidable Mercedes had been specially built for the race. There was a rumor that the directors had held a board meeting and formally agreed that, for propaganda reasons, Mercedes have decided to win the French Grand Prix this year.
In 1914, Mercedes put together a package of cars for the Grand Prix in France that were based on their aircraft engine development. And that meant very light cylinder construction. It was not cast iron, it was forged steel, with welded-on cylinders of sheet metal. This gave very good lightness and very good engineering control. And the chassis was extremely light, agile. Even though it only had rear-wheel brakes, it was very fast in the corners.
37 cars from 6 countries entered the race. Christian Lautenschlager was Mercedes' star driver. Georges Boileau carried France's hopes in the latest Peugeot.
The 1914 Grand Prix probably was one of the most exciting Grand Prix ever put on. Their success was based on efficiency and organization, much like a military organization. Extremely precise signals, They seemed to know exactly where each car was at any point in the race. They had a sort of fox and rabbit situation going where they sent one car out to try to drive other cars off the road. They entered 5 cars, and 2 of their cars dropped out, but those 2 cars were actually what you'd call the rabbit cars that were out front pushing the rest of the field to destruction. And then as they dropped out, the faster cars and their 2 cars, then they would move up in position. So it was a great strategy race, and it worked. They ended up 1, 2, 3 in the French Grand Prix of 1914.
In 2 decades of extraordinary progress, the top speed of racing cars had risen from 20 to over 100 miles an hour. Proof of motorsport's appeal were the 300,000 spectators who watched in stunned silence as Mercedes drove to a 1-2-3 victory. The Grand Prix of 1914 brought motor racing's pioneering epoch to a dramatic end. 3 weeks later, Europe was at war. Bugatti from France. Alfa Romeo from Italy. And Bentley from Britain. When motor racing bred aristocrats, these were the noblest names of all, and they ruled in the Roaring Twenties. Between the wars, Brooklands in Surrey was the home of British motor racing. It was the Ascot of the sport, a social as well as a racing event.
Backing onto this fence but round the corner, please. Thank you. Would you like to follow this car, please?
Today, in the old paddock, owners of veteran cars still meet to talk about their thoroughbreds.
Hugh was a great believer in dry clutches.
Yes, dry.
Oh, Hugh's got the dry. No, it's wet. You must have them wet.
Yeah.
You must have them wet, Peter.
Brooklands was built in 1907 because racing on public roads was banned in Britain. It was the first specially built racing circuit in the world, a place for British car makers to test their cars and for British drivers to compete. The concrete circuit was fast. Competing on it took more courage than skill. Parts of it were straight and level, but the great attraction was the perilous banking.
The first sight I had of Brooklands, I remember, was this terrific sweep of banking. And the atmosphere of the place somehow got me. There was something very special about it. There was the sound, the spectacle. You could, in those days, you saw the driver at work. You didn't have to have a crash out if you didn't want to. Not all of them did. And there he was at the top of the banking, fighting this thing, you know, because Brooklands was not actually a boys' track to drive on for real. If you were really going to drive fast at Brooklands, you had to know all about it.
It was always a difficult track and very bumpy. And of course, to drive on the banking with a fast car, you had to use the very top part of the banking, and there wasn't much room for several cars there, so it was a bit dangerous, but very exciting.
Just clinging on with your eyeballs, isn't it? You know, it's got a certain amount of G-force. You know, it just keeps you up there if you're going fast enough. If you're not going fast enough, you're stupid to be up there because you're getting everybody else's way. And it was a cause of a lot of hard feeling from time to time when slower cars were riding too high up on the banking, and the people who were really going fast, who needed all the bloody room they could get, they couldn't get it because some Bert was stuck up much higher than he should be.
Well, I first came to Brooklands in 1933 when Whitney Straight and I were undergraduates at Cambridge, and we flew down from Cambridge, and we weren't allowed motor cars at Cambridge in our first year, so we were allowed to have aeroplanes instead.
Racing at Brooklands was expensive. A Bugatti or Bentley cost over £1,000, 3 times the price of a family house. Spectators paid £1 to get into the paddock when the average wage was £6 a week.
It was unique. It was a magic in it, quite peculiar and particular to Brooklands. And of course, the famous phrase was the right crowd and no crowding.
A lot of the top motoring people also were flyers, flew aircraft here as well as drove cars, and you needed a lot of money for that. So I think there was more of a high society here. Because, of course, in those days, it was just like a horse race course. The betting and the starting and finishing were very much on horse race standards.
Brooklands was then the only place in Britain where cars were raced. It was difficult for ordinary people to reach. The motor racing fans of the day talked in the confident tones of the elite.
Life was an adventure, and we were young and excited, and it was all fun. I came down here first because all my young men were the Bentley boys, who were the dashing, exciting young men of the time, and they all raced here, you see. You know, there was always people pussing with the things and trying to get the aeroplanes going, and of course the cars. They weren't very good in those days, you see. We were always breaking down if we went to a long journey or anything like that.
At a party at my house, a man suggested that women could not drive as well as men. I replied that, on the contrary, I could find 9 amateurs who could drive extremely well. The original idea has developed into a race, and I believe and hope there is a good prize.
Lady de Clifford and I are very glad to have won in our little MG. It's been great fun. I think we've proved that women can drive as well as men.
But Brooklands had its darker side. The last event of the 1932 season was the British Racing Drivers' Club 500-mile race. Among the fastest cars was a favourite of the Bentley boys. They called her Old Number One. It was driven by two brothers, Jack and Clive Dunphy. After a pit stop, Clive took over the wheel. He was soon lapping at over 120 miles an hour on the members' banking, moving high up on the edge to overtake slower cars. And then Dunphy was killed outright. Brooklands was unique, but that uniqueness kept Britain out of the mainstream of motor racing and stunted the development of racing cars. The gates were closed for the war in 1939 and never reopened. In Europe, by contrast, races were run on public roads. Events like the French Grand Prix were hugely popular. Cars were entered by manufacturers rather than individuals. They were built to a formula based on engine size. Racing was closer to normal road conditions, and this benefited car design. The French Grand Prix of 1922 was a 6-hour battle between Bugatti for France and Fiat for Italy. Both teams had new cars. Fiat won and dominated Grand Prix racing for the next 2 years. The challenge, when it came, was from another Italian firm, Alfa Romeo. They had lured away one of Fiat's top designers, Vittorio Jano. In 1924, they unveiled his masterpiece, the P2. The Fiat pedigree was clear. Compact aerodynamic lines with the weight low down and concentrated within the wheelbase. The driver's position was set well to the rear behind a new 8-cylinder 2-litre supercharged engine. It was the product of a single mind, Vittorio Jano, a man whose cars matched his character.
Una persona che univa una grande modestia a delle grandissime qualità.
He was a person in whom great modesty and great virtue existed side by side, as a technician, as a man, and also as a persuader of men.
Quindi, per me, Jano...
So for me, Jano, viewed through the designs he created, he really was a person of great worth, and this P2 is the material evidence of this.
Ne è la materializzazione di questo.
Alfa Romeo built a strong team around the P2s for the 1924 French Grand Prix, their first major race. They put on a stunning performance for a new car, with Antonio Ascari leading in one, followed by Giuseppe Campari in another. On the last lap, disaster almost struck when Ascari's car broke down, but Campari took over the lead. He won 100,000 francs and a giant Lyon sausage. The P2 kept the Alfa Romeo team at the top for 2 seasons. They won most of the major races, and in 1925 they won the first World Championship. "1925 was a watershed year for motor racing. Fearful that racing cars were getting too fast, the sports governing body reduced engine size from 2 litres to 1.5. The P2 had had its day. Faced with the expense of building a completely new car, Alfa Romeo pulled out. Fiat had already gone. Italian dominance was over. The departure of some of these great firms left more room for the smaller, independent car makers. Foremost among them was an Italian designer who'd settled in France before the First World War, a man whose name was to become forever linked with the style and elegance of the cars of the period, Ettore Bugatti. It was one of his cars, the Type 35, which now helped to change the sport. Most racing cars were built in small numbers and driven by works drivers. Bugatti sold them by the 100 to anyone who could afford to race. With more cars and more drivers, motor racing expanded. Bugatti ran a works team, hiring the top drivers to win races and publicise his cars. But most were driven by private individuals. The Type 35 was just the first of a long line of racing Bugattis. The Type 35 caused quite a stir when it made its debut at the French Grand Prix in 1924. It was their appearance, their distinctive radiators, and their aluminium wheels which first attracted attention. Drivers loved the way they handled, but their performance did not match their image. They lacked the power of the supercharged Alphas, and 3 had to withdraw with tyre problems. An illustrious career got off to a bad start. But within a few years, Bugattis dominated European racing, the right car at a time of change. The number of so-called Grand Prix grew, with towns in France and Italy eager to cash in on its popularity, organising their own local events, which they ran without restriction. Bugatti tailored his cars to meet the needs of drivers who wanted to race in them. The Monaco Grand Prix was one such race, and in 1929, its first year, Bugattis came first and second. It was the same the following year. 2 Bugattis out in front, a works entry driven by Louis Chiron and a privately entered car of René Dreyfus.
The only thing that was bad was that I had no more skin on my hands. I had a lot of blisters, and it was very painful. During the race, I didn't feel it, because I only had one thing in mind, is win the race. I started fighting with Chiron, catching up with him stopping at the pit, me passing him, and him having some trouble with his car later on. Finally, after a very big fight, I won the race.
Dreyfus went on to drive for Ettore Bugatti and got to know the man well.
Working for Bugatti was something exceptional. I raced for other factories, but Mr. Bugatti was the boss, true, le patron. If we had a victory, he would greet us. There would be a big dinner at his home, beautifully served. We were his employee, it's true, but we were living with him more than we were with other bosses. Mr. Bugatti was an engineer, as everybody knows. He was not only an engineer, but he was a genius. Mr. Bugatti had a style that was unique. He came from an artist family. You know that his father was a sculptor, his brother also was a very good artist. Mr. Bugatti designed his own factory himself. The Bugatti factory was a little fief. It was like his hometown. Molsheim was a town of perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 people. There was not one family in the town that was not involved with Bugatti. He taught most of them. They came very young in the factory and they stayed very long.
The first time I went there, I was impressed by how beautifully made the details of the buildings were, the doors and the windows, the ironwork. Obviously, there were a lot of craftsmen in that area before Bugatti came. And Bugatti's little kingdom where he lived and had his hobbies of raising horses and making brandy and breeding dogs and making carriages and tack, in addition to all the automotive stuff. It shows you the breadth of the man, how wide his interests and enthusiasms were.
Ettore Bugatti venait très souvent voir l'évolution de son étude.
Ettore Bugatti often came by to see how his work was evolving, and when the work was finished, he'd ask to see what we had done. If he saw it and it wasn't exactly how he had imagined it, he would take a file, a starting handle or some other tool and show the worker. I don't want it like that, I want it like this. Sometimes in the workshops, he modified the parts all by himself.
Il modifiait la pièce quelquefois, lui-même. Il est dans les ateliers.
Everything was beautiful. He was walking always with gloves. He never would come to one of the shops that we had in the factory without his white gloves, touching parts with his gloves. There was a kind of artistry in these cars. They were not only beautiful piece of machinery, but they were almost like jewels, like a beautiful watch.
Bugatti was a perfectionist. He was also reluctant to accept criticism, and when somebody suggested improving his brakes, he said, "I make my cars to go, not to stop."
We didn't have too much brakes. We did need them because the car was doing so well, we didn't need the brakes as much as others would. But that was probably the only flaw that he could find in his cars. But it was a dream. The precision of his steering was something incredible. It was fantastic. He was an artist. He was a dreamer. He never made very much money, so little that very often when we were ready to cash our price money, he was sometimes short, and he would ask her if we would accept to take, for example, a chassis or a car in exchange for the payment of the price, and we would.
As well as his racing success, Ettore Bugatti designed some of the most exquisite passenger cars ever built. But on the racetrack, Bugatti's years at the top were under challenge. There'd been a renaissance at Alfa Romeo. Vittorio Jano brought out the Type B, a lightly built and powerful single-seater.
I can tell you that he was a genius of racing. It was a car that was unbeatable at that time. It was very modern, especially from suspension point of view and also the engine point of view. You know, the main good things of Jano was to design simple things. And in my opinion, it's the best thing you can do in a racing car. It was a great example of racing car of that era, one of the best maybe.
The new Alfas met the latest Bugattis for the first time at the Monaco Grand Prix in 1932. On the twisting circuit, speed was less important than handling, and the Type B outperformed the opposition on the corners. In the hands of two talented drivers of the day, Tazio Nuvolari and Rudolf Caracciola, Alfas took first and second places. Bugatti had been beaten at Monaco, ending an era. The Alfa Romeo Type B showed the way ahead, the first successful single-seater racing car in Europe. Italy was back on top. For 2 years, they won most of the major Grand Prix and many other races. French and Italian car makers had provided most of the contenders in Grand Prix racing. British manufacturers were not in the same league. But Britain had one car to be proud of, the Bentley. The racing Bentleys were hand-built at a small factory in Cricklewood. Like the Bugattis and Alfa Romeos, they embodied the ideas of one man, Walter Owen Bentley, known as W.O.
W.O. was a very gentlemanly man. He was a man of few words. He, one might call him toffee-nosed up to a point, but that's not a true assessment. He was an extremely nice bloke, and he would talk to us in a normal sort of way, and he was always receptive of ideas.
He'd been apprenticed in the railways, and therefore he wanted the idea of a strong, big car engine in his motor cars. And so he developed a 4-cylinder engine of enormous strength and size. This is a 4.5 litre and only 4 cylinders. So it's very, very strong, and it doesn't rev very high, and it's very much a man's motor car, if you can call a car that, in so much that it's a big, lusty engine that goes and goes and goes. He made each of the cylinders to have 4 valves, 2 inlets and 2 outlets. Things that today's Japanese cars they're bringing out and saying that they've got 4 valves and everybody thinks it's new. This man came out with it in 1919. But on top of that basic strength, he put the racing elements of it that enabled the car to sustain high speeds and therefore win at events like Le Mans.
The 24-hour marathon at Le Mans was the race which Bentleys made their own.
L'équipe des Bentley était constituée de riches Anglais.
The Bentley team was made up of rich Englishmen who gave Mr. Bentley lots of money to build them custom cars. They won Le Mans 5 times in a row. It was a team apart, and the pleasure was to watch them arrive together, one after the other, with their big compressors.
The Bentley boys won in 1927, 1928, and in 1929 they filled the first 4 places.
These chaps, they were not interested in making money. They'd already got bags of money, but they were very interested in winning races. And that's what they entered races for.
We're both very happy to have won this wonderful race, and we think you're all very nice to have made such a fuss of us.
Yes, I quite agree. All I'm waiting for now is a drink.
But the Bentley boys' days of excitement and success were rapidly drawing to a close. Racing was expensive, and the company was in serious financial trouble. They won at Le Mans again in 1930. The drivers were Glenn Kidson and Wolf Barnato, who hid the company's real problems behind a mask of confidence.
Well, we had nobody to beat but ourselves. So that was the best way of taking it, was just touring. Is that right, Glenn? That's right.
W.O. Bentley's dream was over. The company failed and was taken over by Rolls-Royce. The Bentleys and the men who drove them are now part of the priceless folklore of motor racing. The company which built these magnificent cars failed for lack of funds. Today, ironically, men will pay millions simply to sit at the controls of a legend.
To me, it was a very special car to get my hands on. It won the 500-mile race at Brooklands at an average of 118 mile an hour, which in its day was the fastest 500-mile race ever run. I'd still want to take it round here and try and drive it faster than any Bentley's been driven before in the Brooklands days, and I still think it's possible.
We have to accept Bugattis in museums because that's somewhere where they finish up by going. But there's only one way for a Bugatti to live, really, and that's for it to continue to be used and for the owners to be prepared to wear the bits out and have to replace them And of course a lot of people take great pleasure in actually taking the cars to bits themselves and actually working on them themselves, and that is at least half the pleasure.
Well, there's nothing sadder than a car in a museum which is obviously hasn't been driven for years. In the case of a racing car, I feel that within certain limits they should be raced and raced hard. They should be allowed to operate in the way that they were designed. They should be able to do what they're so good at.
Carved out of an old royal park just north of Milan lies Monza, one of motor racing's most famous circuits. Here, naturally, the red cars of Italy have tried hardest to win, and in the years after the war, they were triumphantly successful. Monza reflects the Italian passion for racing. For some enthusiasts, the greatest experience of all is to drive their cars around Monza's world-famous circuit.
Monza è il circuito, il primo circuito italiano.
Monza is the main Italian circuit. It came into existence in the 20s, and one could say that the Italian passion for racing and cars is due to Monza. Monza has been the terrain, the environment, the place. You don't have to be a racing driver to come and practice at Monza. When there aren't any races on, Italians can experience the thrill of motor racing. And knowing that they are going around a circuit where great drivers race, it has created this atmosphere, which has given a great impetus to Italian motor racing.
All the great Italian marques have tasted success at Monza: Ferrari, Maserati, and Alfa Romeo. Here, in 1950, Alfa won the first Italian Grand Prix of the new World Championship. Today, Monza is mixing the old and the new. With its most ardent devotees, it evokes the great days of Italian Grand Prix and sports car racing. For a decade after the war, Italy dominated motor racing. The springboard for their victories was a shrewd decision by Alfa Romeo. When war broke out, they hid some of their cars in a cheese factory. This was the Alfa Romeo 158, a successful pre-war racing car. When Grand Prix racing restarted after the war, the Alfetta emerged from its hiding place to sweep all before it.
It actually won every race it entered from 1946 until July of 1951. every single race. I don't think any other Grand Prix car or any other racing car of any description has a record like that. Fangio was world champion with that car. Farina was world champion with that car. It beat everything. And it was constantly being developed. It was always the same design, constantly being updated.
The supercharged engine produced great power, but eventually it did less than 2 miles to the gallon. It was eclipsed by less thirsty cars, but not before it carried off the most prestigious prize of all. When the World Championship was created in 1950, Alfa won it 2 years in a row. Fittingly enough, the first champion was an Italian, Nino Farina. Then came Ferrari and the start of a legend. Alberto Ascari won its first 2 world championships with a record 9 races in a row. Italian cars were the key to victory for foreign drivers too. Juan Manuel Fangio from Argentina became world champion with
I think, more like a truck gearbox, quite honestly, than a Grand Prix car. And having to make, I think it was 23 gear changes per lap. And that race, in those days, was 105 laps. That makes something like 2,500 gear changes I had to do in that motor race without a clutch. And I finished up that particular race with a plate of meat instead of a left hand. And at the end of the race, I got the impression that he was rather disappointed with the performance, whereas I was pretty darn pleased that I actually managed to finish at all, let alone in second place.
The Van Wall was, contrary to many people's belief, was a very difficult and not a nice car to drive. It was good because it won. On certain, so it was extremely good aerodynamic bodywork. A chap called Frank Costin designed it. It really was a good-looking car. It didn't handle that nicely at all. The gearbox was not an easy one to use. The car was not what you call like it was certainly never like a 250F where you could balance it nicely and so on. It was a car where you had to master it rather than drive it.
But for Van der Velde, the sweetest victories occurred at Monza. Brooks remembers the 1958 race.
I got on with the job and eventually was able to overhaul Mike Hawthorne, who was driving Ferrari and was running in first place, and win the race. And it was, a very satisfying race to win because, I say, it was beating the Italians on my home ground. I mean, really, you couldn't get any closer to Enzo Ferrari's factory than Monza in those days.
In 1958, Van Wall won the first ever Constructors' Championship. Not long after, Van der Velde withdrew from racing, the last of the old team patrons. He'd paved the way for the British designers, engineers, managers and sponsors who were to revolutionize motor racing in the next decade. Van der Velde's green cars had finally beaten the red ones of Italy, and now other teams were ready to carry on the fight. Rallying. For the ardent fans, a few unforgettable seconds of excitement. For the drivers, the ultimate test of their skill, courage and stamina. For the cars, an unrelenting struggle with the world's toughest terrain.
Quite why rallying is so popular and why it's so popular almost to the extent that in some countries spectators are still a problem. We could do with it almost being less popular in some countries. I don't really know. There's got to be an element of masochism. The cars throw stones at you and you see them for all of 5 seconds. It's like going to Wimbledon or to the British Grand Prix and getting stuck in a traffic jam. It's almost the Dunkirk spirit. There's that element.
Rallies can last for days, but drivers will battle to gain a few fractions of a second over their rivals. Winning a big rally in this hard world adds lustre to even the best-known showroom names.
There's nearer, my God, to thee. The cars are closer to the cars they run themselves. The drivers are still closer to the general public.
The rewards for success in rallying are sweet. A lifestyle to compensate for the sport's discomforts. While many try, only a few men and women have the skills to reach the top, where modern rallying is a big and flourishing business. But like so much of motorsport, it started out as the pastime of amateurs. Today's rallies can trace part of their origin to a pre-war event known in Britain as the Reliability Run. The car clubs which organised these runs chose routes designed to test the strengths and weaknesses of the cars. Though they were light-hearted occasions for the participants, for the manufacturers there was a serious side, a chance to observe how their cars performed.
They were very, very important indeed for giving a car a good name, you might say, because reliability was probably one of the most important things, if not the most important, when cars started. Consequently, I mean, they were wonderful testing grounds for your car. I mean, there weren't all the sophisticated testing arrangements that there are now. There were quite a few hybrids that used to turn up, and people would experiment with this. In fact, we tried all kinds of things. I can remember filling tyres with water once, and it was absolute disaster because it went round like a bob weight. You couldn't fill them completely with water. The hills were all different conditions. Locals had a habit of doctoring certain hills just to make it more fun for them to spectate. You know, they'd like to see somebody drop into a load of cow mess and something like that. You know.
Demonstrating driving skill has always played an important part in rallying. The Monte Carlo Rally, the longest established and most famous event of them all, always ended on the promenade with a test designed to show that the driver had full mastery of the car. Women took part as well as men, and although there were special prizes for women, all drivers had to match their skills and their cars against some of the harshest terrain in Europe. The attraction of the Monte Carlo Rally has always been the challenge of driving against the elements, in particular the ice and snow of the Alps. The rally had one unusual feature. Competitors started from all over Europe and took different routes to Monte Carlo. It was still an expedition as well as an adventure. There were few facilities for the motorists en route. Competitors had to be self-sufficient. They fitted their cars with all sorts of gadgets, some to counter the harsh conditions, others to make the trip as comfortable as possible for the drivers. It was a well-mannered affair, but only up to a point.
Men always think that they can drive much better than a lady, and so all the time you're sort of having to prove to them that this is not true, because there were very few ladies, and there's not much fun just beating the ladies, you want to beat the men.
When I started rallying in the 50s, of course, there was no such thing as practice or pace notes or anything. We used to go to a rally no service, with, say, 2 spare wheels, a fan belt, set of brakes, pads later, and of course linings before, shock absorbers maybe, spare can of petrol because there weren't too many petrol stations about, and we'd go off and do it.
Some competitors started from Scotland, completing part of the route in Britain before crossing the Channel to France. But from wherever they started, all had to share the Monte's ultimate challenge, the route over the Alps.
On one of the world's most scenic and most difficult highways, the final leg of the supreme test of sheer driving skill, the Monte Carlo Rally. From a dozen different cities all over the continent, the cars converge on the Principality, all taking the same hair-raising route over the Alps in the home stretch.
Rallying in the 50s and 60s was less expensive because the cars were much closer to standard. The sort of cars I would be rallying on a Saturday would go back into the showroom on a Sunday or be the dealer's demonstrator on the Monday.
The annual event is always something of a shocker to the quiet mountain villages along the way.
Once you get onto the common route, you're in the mountains then, and of course normally you're in snow. Any one of them's hazardous when you're trying to go a bit too far on a slippery road up in the mountain.
Over 357 miles of winding, twisting, icy, treacherous road, racing the clock and fighting to keep within a complex set of speed and safety rules.
Monte, of course, was on snow, and in the old days we didn't have studded tyres or anything. It was very dicey indeed, down the hairpins with no stud.
On one Monte Carlo rally, we were going down one of the very difficult mountain stages on ice and snow at about 70 miles an hour. And I was holding my breath and thinking, what on earth am I doing here? Why am I here? I should be at home. I've got 3 children. I should be at home.
The difficulties and dangers of the frozen alpine roads gave the Monte Carlo its special place in rallying history. Even without snow and ice, the Alps offered a formidable challenge, an ideal environment for a rally, testing driving skill to the limit. Another of the great international events in the 1950s was the Coupe des Alpes, which took place in the July sunshine.
The Alpine was always summer, and that was the lovely rally to do. We all loved that because it was in the south of France, the start and finish. And you used to have a rest day, 2 rest days in the rally at lovely places like Cortina or somewhere really nice, so you could relax for 24 hours and swim, and it was a great rally as well.
The Alpine Rally was a duel between car and mountains, with speed thrown in to add to the excitement. Average speeds in the Alpine Rally were high. The roads were demanding and sometimes in poor condition. There were difficult passes like the Stelvio. The Stelvio had 58 hairpin bends in 25 kilometres and was covered as a special stage which drivers had to take as fast as possible. To add to the difficulties, the roads were not closed, so competitors had to adjust their speed to take account of ordinary road users.
We were so near winning an Alpine Cup so many times, and then something seemed to go wrong almost at the last minute.
Anne Hall drove for the Ford Works team.
We were almost at the end, and suddenly I applied the brakes, and the brakes weren't good enough to hold back the car with the power that we had. And it slid, and it slid, and we went straight over the edge of the mountain. We really should have been killed, but luckily there was a huge, huge rock, and we just rested on the rock, and we teetered backwards and forwards on this rock.
As rallies became more competitive, rally drivers looked for faster cars. Some drivers found one in the Austin Healey 3000, a sports car which evoked the spirit of the time.
The Healey, I think every driver who drove it was frightened of it. They held the road very well on dry tarmac, but if you hit some gravel or sand, let alone ice or snow, it wasn't very funny. Of course, they were very front heavy. They had 200 horsepower approximately at the end. They were very difficult, but we thought they were great because they were fast.
As the 50s drew to a close, rallying at the top level began to change. While always competitive, at heart it had been an amateur affair. Now it was to become a full-time professional sport, which demanded constant practice.
The organisers seem to have the knack of giving you just enough time, your class of car, to do the stage with a minute to spare, if you're lucky. There were certain stages where you had to drive absolutely flat out to wind up at the control with seconds to spare. They'd just make it possible. But if you drove every section that hard, you'd break the car. It would never last. We had knock-off switches on the brake lights. Now, if somebody got up behind me, and of course, if they'd take driving off your brake lights and off you through a road that's wiggling through a mountain, their lights make it difficult for you to see. And secondly, they can brake where you're braking, so they've got an advantage. So what we used to do after a while was to let them get used to it, and then all of a sudden, when a real good 90-degree one comes up, just knock the brake lights off. And they didn't go off the road, but it used to upset them quite a bit, and then you didn't have any more trouble.
Increased professionalism and increased speed made rallying more attractive to spectators. The final stages of the Alpine Rally were virtually short road races and exciting to watch, and so manufacturers used rallying more and more to promote their cars. Rallying was shedding its old-world, gentlemanly traditions. The sporting bonhomie gave way to a brasher, more aggressive commercial approach. Winning at all costs became the objective. New works teams joined the fray. Rallying was growing, and so was its competitiveness.
Maybe över bra, en flat bra, 100, down and up. Caution, flat right over bra, 70, mud, slippy. Absolute right over bra, 70.
Today's rally car has come a long way since the amateur days of the Monty. This Mazda may look like a sporty version of the company's saloon car. In fact, it's been specially built for the job. Nothing has been left to chance. The body shell has been strengthened, the engine has been specially prepared, and the car is packed with the latest technology.
Flat bra, 80.
Success depends on a high level of teamwork between the driver and co-driver. In the 1950s, drivers and co-drivers had to do almost everything for themselves, from plotting the route to looking after the car. Co-drivers were the jacks of all trades. They had to maintain the car and fill it up from garages along the way. They carried money to pay for the petrol and anything else the car might need. But as the sport grew more professional, their main task became interpreting the pace notes which described every section of the route.
Long flat right, and it's a hairpin left. Interesting straight.
Knowing exactly what was ahead was the only way the driver could maintain the speeds needed to complete a section on time.
Yep. Quick left.
It was self-preservation as well as the desire to beat the competition that really instigated the formation of pace notes. We had a huge accident on the Acropolis Rally in Greece where we flew off the road in an Austin Healey 3000. It was before the days of seatbelts. We were both thrown out, and luckily, Peter was only slightly injured. I landed on the only patch of grass within 3 square miles, and the car rolled down the mountainside and destroyed itself completely.
Pace notes were prepared during practice. Their accuracy was all important.
A section on the Col de Turini, on the Monte Carlo Rally, would go something like this. 100, hairpin right. 300. Now that isn't 300 yards or 300 meters. That just tells the driver that there's a very long straight following a slow bend, so that gives him plenty of time to position his car correctly and to get it into the right gear and perhaps put it sideways before he comes to a fast left which opens out into a hairpin left. And then another 300, again a long straight, but at the end of that there is a right max and fast left over a crest.
And I mean, can you imagine coming up to a brow in the road and the co-driver says to you it's flat out and it looks like you're going to go over a cliff? I mean, it does make a hell of a difference. It makes at least 10%, maybe even up to nearly 20% difference in the speed you can go.
International rallying moved up a gear with the arrival of Scandinavia's star drivers. Their driving skills had been developed in the harsh conditions of the north. They knew how to drive fast on rough roads, the key to victory. One of the first was Erik Karlsson, who drove a Saab. Then came Hannu Mikkola and Timo Mäkinen.
In Scandinavia in those days, a good rally driver was more praised than a good footballer. And therefore, every Scandinavian wanted to become a good rally driver because you were a hero of the country. I mean, you could do what you liked. You were given freedom of the city, whatever it was.
The Scandinavians taught the next generation of rally drivers how it should be done.
They came over with unusual driving techniques, experimenting, for instance, by putting the left foot on the brake to try and pivot the back of the car around while they kept the right foot on the accelerator. They did incidentally change gear without using the clutch because they weren't paying for the gearboxes.
Keep it out and put it second gear, out any clutch, using left foot braking.
If you use left foot braking, it is much safer. You can go faster and you can get away with more.
Full power, second gear.
If you went into a corner too quickly, if you left foot braked, if you kept the power on at the same time, the two front wheels kept turning so you could control the car better. I didn't do it anyway, so I went off the road quite often, but or maybe not so fast.
As well as professional teams and new driving techniques, rallying now discovered a revolutionary car, the Mini. One of the first to appreciate its potential was Paddy Hopkirk.
One great thing about the Mini is so small that a narrow road looks like a big road to it. So in the Monte Carlo Rally, I mean, I remember with snowbanks on either side, the car, you could actually get the car more sideways than a big car. So the Mini could really perform in those narrow lanes.
The brave new world ushered in by the Minis and the Works teams met the old guard of rallying on the Monte Carlo in 1961. On their first outing, they were beaten by Karlsson in a Saab. Then in 1964, Paddy Hopkirk won it in a Mini. Timo Mäkinen did the same in 1965. In 1966, Minis came first, second and third. It was too much for the organisers.
The French were so astounded by the Mini's performance and winning the Monte Carlo Rally for the third time that they didn't believe that we weren't cheating. The thing is, they actually counted all the teeth in the gear wheels and the gearbox. They took the tires off the wheels and weighed the wheels, weighed the tires separately. I mean, it was ridiculous. They couldn't find anything wrong. And they eventually disqualified us on the lights. The lights, we were dipping onto spotlights, which was technically illegal, but didn't help us to win the rally. So they disqualified us 1, 2, 3, and of course that gave the Mini 10 times as much publicity as if we'd won the rally, because the whole world was saying the French are at it again and not playing the ball.
Rally drivers have always looked for a new challenge away from the regulated roads and crowded urban areas of Europe. A place where they can pit their cars and skills against even tougher terrain. They found one such challenge on the long deserted roads of the African bush in the Safari Rally in Kenya.
I think for us
European drivers, we are so used to drive flat out in every rally in Europe that most difficult is just to find speed that car will hold all these 5,000 kilometers, and not to drive 100%, we have to find the right speed, not to drive too slow to be the second, but not to drive too fast to break the car. That's the most difficult thing.
The Safari Rally was originally organised for local enthusiasts, but it wasn't long before European drivers discovered its attractions.
The Safari Rally is the big event of the Easter holidays in Kenya. Everybody in the country is interested. People come from hundreds of miles to watch it being run in their particular areas. My navigator had to be chosen from someone who lived out there because it was very essential that they spoke Swahili, because the areas that we covered were areas where nobody ever travelled. The only people that were there were virtually the natives and missionaries. You had everything that could be thrown at you, plus animals. The safari, besides being a wonderful rally, obviously has these terrible hazards. You have bridges with no sides. You're rushing down a hill, and we went over a little concrete bridge, which was about 6 inches wider each side than the car. If you slid, you were off. We ran into red mud, and we just ran in and straight out again, not badly. But suddenly the car wouldn't steer after a very short period of time. The mud had set inside the wheel, and it was like iron almost. We had to stop, get a hammer, and chisel all the mud out from the wheel before we could carry on.
There are some things that just can't be anticipated.
Peter Job's Hillman Husky is soon to retire when his co-driver, Jungle Jim Alexander, succumbs to an insect bite. Too much scenery and too little time. Too much dust, too. By now, the cars are carrying loads of it.
The dust was unbelievable, it really was. It would come up the door pillars and get into the roof lining. So when you hit a big bump, you'd get this red mist coming down. The front suspension just broke, just fell apart. I'd have to stop and tighten it up. Well, we took it in turns, and I got out on one occasion, and because you're lying flat on your back with your feet into the bush at the side, and I could hear something moving very close, and I got back in that car so fast it wasn't true.
Once in Safari we went so deep water that all the lights were under the water, and actually the water was coming over the windscreen, and I can tell you that's a funny feeling, because you can see all this light in the water actually, and you just trust your nose that in 10 meters it will be over, you know. And rallying that's why so interesting, because you never really know what you are going to get.
The car against the elements is an enduring theme in rallying. The engineers are constantly seeking to improve a car's performance, using the latest technology to master rally's unrelenting roads. In the 1970s, another revolutionary car appeared when Audi introduced four-wheel drive.
It was a really exciting time, because I think we were the first ones to use the four-wheel drive concept, and it was so many things that nobody really knew. With the rear-wheel drive cars, we could use maybe 300 horsepower, but then it was just spinning, and the rear tires were just finished after 2-3 kilometers. But four-wheel drive car, then we could go up to 550 horsepower and still get good grip and not too much wheel spin. Also, when you are sideways, four-wheel drive car, it's always pulling with the four wheels inside of the pen, so the speed is higher. Then you can use the snowbanks. If you are sliding a little bit wide or you drive a little bit too fast, you can always lean a little bit the snow wall, and it doesn't matter so much.
Audi's success ushered in a new, even more competitive era in Europe. It was a battle between manufacturers to be the top name in the sport. Peugeot joined the contest with a remarkable car, the 205 Turbo 16, built specifically for rallying. It had four-wheel drive, was mid-engined, following the example of Formula One and sports cars, and was turbocharged. The team had to be backed up by a complex servicing operation, often in the middle of nowhere. But the investment was worth it. Peugeot was soon in the top class of rallying, and sales of the 205 soared.
It was like a copybook example what the manufacturer can do in rallying, how they can start from scratch, how they can be successful, and how we can help the rest of the factory to make a remarkable turnaround in the financial terms. And having been involved in the middle of it right from the start was very, very rewarding, not only as a driver, but you felt you were part of the big project and really contributing.
Companies now had to pay heavily to join in the game, and even more to win. The best drivers cost a lot. So did investment in engineering. But the biggest commitment came in team support, in backing up the drivers with mechanics, vehicles to move them about, helicopters, and spare parts.
A team will go into the Monte Carlo rally as the classic example, and will think in terms of 1,000 wheels and tyres. 1,000. That's per car, not for the team. So if you've got 3 cars, 3,000 wheels and tyres. You don't use them all, of course. But if you've got special stages spread across France, and you're not sure that the tyre vehicles will be able to move around because of the weather, then you've got to have, if there are 8 different sorts of tyres, you've got to have 8 sets here, 8 sets here, 8 sets, and so on, and very quickly permutate up to 1,000. Quite absurd.
Despite the costs, more and more manufacturers are participating. The latest recruits are the Japanese giants Toyota, Mazda and Mitsubishi. Rallying flourishes. The challenge of car and driver competing against the elements is still compulsive. That's why fans will endure any conditions to share a few exhilarating seconds of the sport's excitement.
We're reaching the stage now that we're seeing on rallies results after a day's rallying closer between the top 10 than after an hour and a half Formula One. It's amazing.
The cars racing on Grand Prix circuits in the years after the war were conventional in design. Engines at the front, traditionally built, high-performance versions of cars you might almost see on the road. The Ferrari was typical, powerful, heavy and orthodox. Then out of England burst the rear-engine Cooper. In 3 years, it consigned its front-engine rivals to history. Sterling Moss ushered in the revolution in 1958 in Argentina. He drove a privately entered Cooper and gambled on its tyres.
In the Argentinian Grand Prix, it was the first big race for a rear-engine car, I think. And we had Rob Walker's car there. So I said to Rob, no way can we change these wheels. We hadn't got knockoffs or anything. And I'm going to save the tyres right through as much as possible. And the race started, and as often happens, of course, you get a group out, and I got at the back of the group, and I was slipstreaming them on the straight, so I could then go around the corner, understeering round, using all the road gently as possible. If I saw oil, I'd go over the oil, and when I came out of the corner and everything was okay, I'd go over the grass, which was relatively cool. And I just sat there, and I never tried to get the lead, obviously, until the cars started to peel off and went in. And then I inherited the lead because they pulled off. And then I can remember it so well. I'm going around, and suddenly the tread went, and these are on the fronts, you know, which is really worrying because I could see those. And I remember going around and thinking, well, you know, I can't stop now. My God, I'm winning the Argentine Grand Prix in this little rear-engine 2.2-litre coupe. When I crossed the line, I just couldn't believe it.
This first victory for a rear-engine car owed much to Moss's driving skills. So it wasn't altogether surprising that few people took this revolutionary concept seriously.
Quando la Cooper si presentò, tutti noi la guardavamo ridendo, dicevamo quello, scusi, non so come dirlo.
When the Cooper arrived, we all looked at it and laughed. We said, that thing, that little squirt, such a tiny car. Looks like a flea compared to our cars. But it had lightness. Its rear engine was an absolute novelty.
Posteriore, novità assoluta.
A rear, or more accurately mid-engine car has several advantages. It's lighter, so it brakes better and accelerates faster. With much of its weight near the centre, it's easier to steer. And with the driver seated lower down, the car is more aerodynamic. The unlikely birthplace of the rear-engine revolution was a garage in Surrey, the workshop of the Coopers, Father Charles and son John. Here, with a small workforce, they turned out simple but winning racing cars. Blacksmith jobs, they were called. John was dismissed as a garage keeper by some of the grander constructors.
When the war finished, we decided we'd go into the motor racing with the 500 formula, which was a new formula that was formed with using a motorcycle engine, in other words, like a four-wheeled motorcycle, if you like. And basically that's the start of our rear-engine car, really, because it has the engine in the back. Norton's originally wouldn't sell us engines, so we bought the whole bikes, the featherbed motorbikes, and then we took the engines out and sold the frames to people afterwards. There was a great shortage of steel after the war, and we bought all the Morrison shelters we could find, by golly. And we used to cut those sheets up and made our wishbone lugs of them, engine mounting brackets, out of these sheets. And we used to use the legs to make our chassis jigs and that sort of thing. And also we bought a lot of stuff from, there was a firm in Kingston called Coley's that sold second-hand aircraft equipment, especially aircraft petrol pumps and things like that.
So the rear-engine concept came about not through some sudden inspiration, but because the Coopers built their first cars around a motorcycle engine, which, positioned near the middle of the bike, chain drives the rear wheel. They may have stumbled on their innovative design, but they had the good sense to exploit it. Their early cars dominated Formula 3, the next step was Formula 2, and the goal, Formula 1. They were helped in their task by the arrival of a 30-year-old from Australia, a man who combined an outstanding talent for driving with engineering know-how. Jack Brabham. His technical skills played a vital part in the creation of the Cooper Grand Prix cars.
John Cooper was a man who helped me greatly in motor racing here, and we struck up a wonderful friendship together, and it became a team effort between us, really.
When the car was joined to the new Coventry Climax engine, the revolution was complete.
The 2.5-litre engine Climax had good torque, and it was a beautiful, smooth engine to drive. Although it may not have had the horsepower of the Ferrari, it certainly had the reliability and flexibility and made it very easy from the driving point of view. We really had an advantage over the Ferrari in all respects. A, for aerodynamics, B, our braking was much better than the Ferrari because our car was a lot lighter.
I said Ferraris up to around 1960 were just a magnificent engine on four wheels. The front engine cars were still built as cars had always been built, had forged suspension parts, and they were much, much heavier than the Coopers.
We just used common sense, and what we felt was right. And one of our things was we made our cars strong so they didn't break. What's the point of spending all the money on motor racing and you don't finish the race? Our whole attitude was to finish the race.
In 1959 and 60, they usually finished first.
It's Brabham all the way now. The race and the World Championship are his, with just one lap to go. And team manager John Cooper welcomes his winner home. But there's something wrong. It's McLaren, number 9, who takes the checkered flag. There's consternation in the Cooper pit. Brabham should have come through first. But Jack Brabham, out of petrol, is still in the race. He's got to push that car more than 450 yards to the finishing line. And that after more than 2 hours of driving at 100 miles an hour. This is the sort of courage that makes champions.
Bruce McLaren, in another Cooper, took the checkered flag, but Brabham had already won the British and Monaco Grand Prix, and in 1960 would win 5 more.
The other cars roar past, and Jack Brabham pushes his way to the Motor Racing Championship of the world.
And now meet, in person, the World Motor Racing Champion of 1959, Jack Brabham, driving his World Championship winning car, the Cooper. Hope you can stop.
The old circuit at Reims saw the rear-engined revolution come of age. 17 of the 20 starters were British, and 10 of them were Coopers.
The 1960 race at Reims was probably one that will stick in my mind for quite a long time. The Ferraris there, the 2 works Ferraris, were driven by Phil Hill and Von Trips, and it finished up a fantastic duel between us.
Thrills at the French Grand Prix start the moment the flag drops. Hill's BRM in the front row fails to start. Plantignon's Cooper rams it, Halford's Cooper goes into a spin, and Bianchi's Cooper pulls away with a crushed radiator cowl. Somehow the mess sorts itself out, though there's some hasty patching up for the pit stop to do.
I can remember going up past the pits, we were even going over the top of the hill there, 3 abreast, and it was a really neck-and-neck race, and it wasn't until about the last few laps of the race when Phil Hill was getting really desperate and I really had the better of him. At the end of the straight, I looked in the rear vision mirror just as I was about to turn right down into the pit straight and saw Phil Hill coming down the inside with all 4 wheels locked, smoke coming off the wheels, and I was able to just keep straighten the car up instead of turning in. And Phil Hill went by me, and I think finished up almost in Reims itself. And that left me on my own for the last few laps and won the race quite comfortably.
Coopers filled the first 4 places. A front-engine Ferrari would win only 1 more Grand Prix. After that, even Ferrari followed John Cooper's lead.
And that was the big revolution of 59-60, when every car had to have the rear engine like they have still today. And it was the end of the Italian constructors and the big development of the English.
And it was an Englishman, Colin Chapman, who now emerged as the outstanding innovator in motorsport. Chapman began by setting up his company Lotus, which built competition cars and went on to make road-going sports cars. But Chapman's lifelong passion was motor racing, and his manufacturing company, especially in the early days, was there to support it. Throughout 25 years in Formula One, Chapman died of a heart attack when only 54. He pioneered an astonishing range of innovations. Not all worked, but the many that did created the shape of the Grand Prix cars we know today.
Colin was gutsy, and he was very intelligent and innovator. Here's a man that he transformed the face of Grand Prix racing in many ways.
He was very enthusiastic, obviously, and the people who worked for him were obviously enthused by his total energy and commitment to actually winning.
I had great respect for Colin Chapman, the greatest Formula One Grand Prix car designer of all time, I would say.
We basically go racing because I like it. I like going racing. I've always been involved in racing. I like the competitiveness of it. I like the comradeship of it. And I also like the technical fallout that comes from it. We do learn a tremendous amount from racing.
Two early landmark Chapman cars were the Lotus 18 and the 25. Chapman studied the Cooper design and improved on it. His first successful Formula One car was the 18. Called by one critic a shoebox with 4 dustbin lids, it was still more competitive than the Coopers. Innes Ireland drove for Lotus at the time. He won races in the 18, and in a later version, he even won a Grand Prix. As he helped to make Lotus a name to watch, he experienced the good and the bad of driving a Chapman pioneering car.
The Lotus 18 was quite an easy car to drive. Its shape was all wrong. I could never quite understand how Colin didn't finish up making it that shape. It was a bit like a streamlined brick. In the dry, it was absolutely superb and would outhandle anything of that day. In the works cars, we had Colin's own gearbox, which was very, very positive when all the parts of the gearbox were new. Sadly, in those days, Chapman didn't have the money to renew all the parts every race. So as they got worn, it was quite easy to finish up with a box full of neutrals. The gearbox became a nightmare. It was always referred to as the queer box.
The 18 got Lotus off to a winning start in Formula One, but to gain the World Championship, Chapman opted for a radically new car and a young Scots driver, Jim Clark. In 1962, Chapman unveiled his next design sensation, the Lotus 25 with a monocoque chassis. Instead of a frame of tubes welded together, here was a chassis made as a single shell, stronger, lighter, safer. Cradled within it was the V8 Coventry Climax engine. The monocoque design with rubber fuel tanks neatly installed along the sides was soon taken up by other teams. Meanwhile, the Lotus 25, driven by Jim Clark, stormed to 10 Grand Prix wins in 2 years, giving Chapman the first of his 7 World Constructor Championships. Then Coventry Climax gave up making racing engines, and Chapman needed a new power unit.
Teams have got to rely on other people providing engines for them. And so here was the new, beautiful, shiny Lotus team that was really not going to go anywhere because it couldn't get an engine. Along in 65 or thereabouts came this opportunity to do this extraordinary Cosworth Ford engine, which remains the greatest racing engine in history, I think. I'd had a great impression of Keith Duckworth because he'd worked with Colin and we'd spent a lot of evenings drinking beer together and arguing about cars and where they were going. And so I went over and I told Mr. Ford that I'd like to have $323,000 for the Grand Prix engine. He said very simply, what will it do? And I said, well, I think it'll win a Grand Prix, maybe more, and I think there's a chance of it winning a World Championship.
Keith Duckworth and his Cosworth Engineering Company set about designing an engine. The result was this, the ingenious 8-cylinder Ford Cosworth DFV engine.
Keith Duckworth is totally obsessive with perfection, and the combination of that remarkable ability, totally applied, is produced over a period of perhaps 15 years. Certainly the greatest engine designer the world's ever seen, maybe ever will see.
When Formula Junior was announced, the rules stated that it had to be a production engine. And of the various engines that came along was the new Ford Anglia engine, which arrived just at the time that we were about to start and looked as though it should run to high RPM and therefore that we should be able to get a lot of air through it and a lot of power. The power output of an engine being the size of the bangs times the number of bangs per minute that you can manage to get.
Then a sort of half-tax exile in Paris. He came over, got in the car and won first time out, and we never looked back. Noticed Ford in Formula One at that year, and the following was so dominating that I was frightened that we'd kill the sport because I couldn't see why we shouldn't win everything. So I said to Colin at the German Grand Prix that I'm afraid we'll kill the sport if we go on this way. We're just going to have to make the engine available for everybody. And he said, yes, I agree. It was a most magnanimous gesture because I had a deal with him and he could have said no. But thereafter, as Ken Tyrrell has pointed out, you could buy the Ford DFE engine, go and buy a chassis and become world champion.
Jim Clark and his consummate driving skill were key factors in Chapman's progress.
Clark stands out above all because of his ability to drive any kind of car and win. And Colin Chapman and him are the best of friends, you know, like brothers, really. So you knew with that partnership, you were halfway there to start with.
I did get very, very close to Jim Clark. He was, I would say, my best friend I've ever had. We got on terribly well together. I understood exactly what he wanted and so on, and I think he understood exactly what I meant, and we conversed on the subject. Plus, we were very good friends off the track. And this is the tragedy of motor racing, is when you do get close to a driver and there is an accident, of course, it hurts you so much more.
Innovation brings risks, and at times Chapman's cars had a reputation for weakness and unreliability.
Basically, Colin's concept of a racing car was that if it didn't brake, it was too strong and you should make it lighter. And theoretically, he thought a racing car should do the race and then fall to bits as it crossed the line. So the cars were always flimsy. In 1959, I had 4 complete brake failures. And I mean the complete brake failures. I mean just nothing.
So in his own way, if you finished, a race, a 200-mile Grand Prix, and then in the cool-off lap, the wheel fell off, mission accomplished in his own way. If the car would have lasted another 200 miles, it's overbuilt. It's too heavy. So that's how he played it. But, he got caught more than once.
Yes, I should think so. Yeah, if you can get it on time.
Colin Chapman had a lot of charm. He could get people to do virtually anything. If he was scheming on the cars and saw a way of doing something, he'd quickly sketch it out and say, this is what I want, rub his hands together. Come on, let's get it on the cars, we're away, He always seemed to get what he wanted.
Aerodynamics were another Chapman speciality. He experimented with high-mounted rear wings to improve his car's performance, not always successfully. These days, though, a version of these aerofoils has become a standard feature on Formula One cars.
Can we set the slow running up a sniff? How difficult is that? All right, no, we'll do that in the paddock. Right, if you can get out again now. Is it all back on? Right, it's all back on again.
Oh, wait a minute.
Isn't it quick?
Colin Chapman had come up with another innovation, and they were high wings. We tried it at the French Grand Prix in 1968 in Rouen, and it was fantastic. Clearly, even on the third lap out in the car, even though I didn't know the circuit, the amount of grip that you were getting from these devices was phenomenal. I'm not sure what happened. Coming into my third lap in qualifying, I approached the fast downhill section just before the pits there on that street circuit in France, and the back of the car snapped away from me. And then it just started to go backwards, but it didn't spin completely, it only went halfway, and then started to go backwards, and then it went the whole turn again, and next thing I saw was the wall here. Whether it was a mistake, or whether, as some believe, and I do, that this tall rear wing up on stalks suddenly fell over backwards, and as it went over backwards, of course, the downforce incidence from this position turned to lift in this position as it went over backwards, and may have picked the back wheels of the car off the ground. But anyway, the result was that I hit the entrance of a chateau, which was wrought iron gates. Fortunately, I didn't hit the wrought iron gates, otherwise I would have been like cheese through a grater. I hit the retaining walls either side, probably at about 120 miles an hour. And all I could see was this dust settling, and the picture, I thought it was heaven actually, because it was a picture of this beautiful chateau, this drive with the chateau at the end of it, and cows grazing in the fields. It wasn't until Colin Chapman, who ran across the track, because it was right opposite the pits, came and shook me on the shoulder, saying, "What happened, what happened, what happened?" But I realised I was still around.
Oh, dearie me. Brandy, I think. Cool, you were white. You're better now. You were pretty white 10 minutes ago. I think you ought to sit down. Sit down in the... Really? I saw that wall coming up.
Chapman was competitive to his fingertips. On the occasion, he was quick to try to turn Oliver's crash to his advantage, with some gamesmanship at the expense of his rival, Bruce McLaren.
You didn't hit anything, did you? You haven't actually hit anything all the time when it's spun. No, you didn't hit anything.
All I'd done was spun at the hairpin. That slow lap.
You see, the whole of the rear suspension is in fact hung on that gearbox. And if that breaks, well, that's it. But then they're all on the same basis. Hey, Bruce, look, I think I better tell you, the gearbox bell housing broke, and you know the whole of our rear suspension's hung on the gearbox, same as yours. And it's just broken in half in the middle. You know, the bell housing's got a hell of a load in it, if you think about it. That's all that's happened, it's just broken in half. I'm bringing Graham in, I'm not going to run him like that. You better have a look and see if there's any cracks in your bell housing. Do you think we ought to...
This incident demonstrated how sometimes Chapman's innovations were at the ragged edge of technology, but his determination and inventive genius saw him through most problems.
These things tended to make you a bit, think a bit, but still you drove the cars as hard as you could, and I always had implicit faith in Colin, purely because of his innovative ideas and appreciation of what went on in a racing car. He had tremendous understanding.
At the end of the 60s came arguably Chapman's most enduring legacy. He realised that only sponsorship of his Grand Prix team could pay the enormous costs of running it. His decision may have offended the traditionalists, but it secured the future of Lotus and other teams, and supported Chapman in his ceaseless quest for technological innovation.
It is from the sponsors that the money comes. I suppose, in crude terms now, more or less, if you think of each start of each Grand Prix, costs more or less £1 million or thereabouts a car. And that money, in the end, has to come from one form or another of sponsorship. And there'd always been sponsorship, in a sense, from the oil companies, from the tyre companies. That gone on since time immemorial, and was really what paid for it at the top level. Then suddenly they brought a tobacco company in, and that changed everything.
When the cigarette people, they stopped them advertising on television completely, Colin Chapman took out a competition license in the name of Gold Leaf Team Lotus and sprayed the cars red and white like a gold leaf packet. And really that was the start of real money in motor racing, really. It happened then.
the sheer creativity in the 60s of all those young Brits who were doing it on sheer enthusiasm have now really created in this country a British motor racing industry second to none in the world.
Chapman was unique. I think if he'd have been alive now, he would have gone on to one more Grand Prix, and the likes of Ferrari and McLaren would have been second place to someone like Lotus.
Next week's programme sees how, since the 30s, some of the world's top production sports cars first proved themselves on the racetrack.
The sports car, a symbol of youth, freedom, vitality. It has three potent qualities: good looks, superb engineering, and power. The traditional sports car looked at home on the open road, but felt as if it ought to be on the racetrack. Today, racing sports cars can be driven only on the racetrack at speeds of over 200 miles an hour. Here, the task is to win the race and attract the attention of potential sports car buyers. Today, the track has become an extension of the showroom.
Sports car racing in the old days, I know in Ireland, it was a case of the racing was secondary to what you did in the pub afterwards. You know, first man onto the stool to have a pint in his hand won the race. But now it's high tech. Now we have major manufacturers who want to make statements about their company, their cars, their machinery, and they do that by being successful on the racetrack. This track here is very tight, it's demanding, grueling, bumpy. I mean, all the adjectives you could use describes this space perfectly. On top of that, it's very hot here.
I look at these race cars, and every time I get into one, it's the finest that technology can build. It's like, an Air Force jet or the space shuttle or something to that nature. It's just a thing of the future.
You come in and you're just fighting for your life, and you're terrified, and you have the death grip on the wheel. They ask you something like, what's the water temperature? I says, don't ask me, you don't think I have time to look, do you? You know. So here it is very, very difficult. You're always in a turn. I mean, no kidding. You're never not turning the wheel. And that alone makes it very difficult. No time whatsoever to relax.
And away they go on the 4-mile course that encircles potato fields and plush country estates.
40 years ago, people raced sports cars for fun.
An NG turn.
Sports car owners drove to the meeting, competed, and if the car was still in one piece, drove home again. MGs originated in the 1920s, the brainchild of Cecil Kimber. He managed to create the right mixture of image and performance. Because they were also driven on ordinary roads, they had to have mudguards, lights, and traffic indicators. People who bought them were buying more than a means of transport. They were saying something about themselves. They belonged to an exclusive club. Many racing drivers had their first taste of competition in an MG.
And I was a great admirer of the MG Mark as a youth because of this sort of team involvement that they had, this little tiny company and the neat-looking little cars, single overhead cam inline sixes, supercharged to a high degree and getting enormous outputs per unit capacity, more so than the auto unions and the Mercedes were doing in the late 30s, which few people know. Today, when you say MG, people think of that funny little sports car that was around and they're just sort of, you know, nothing. But to me, I was intrigued as anything as to how they managed. That was what sort of bent me over toward the European road racing type of thing.
European manufacturers had a tradition of building elegant sports cars, and after the war, there was a hunger for distinctive cars. Jaguar moved into this market in 1948 with the XK120. It was a road car with racing potential, capable of 132 miles an hour. To improve their image, Jaguar decided to go racing.
The whole thing was done on the basis of we are not motor racing for fun, we are motor racing to make the name of Jaguar. And which race will give us the maximum publicity? And the answer was Le Mans 24 Hours.
The world's finest sports cars and drivers begin the grueling 24-hour grind at Le Mans. That is the premier race of them all.
Le Mans is more than just a motor race. It's a whole weekend of entertainment, a festival of speed and endurance, a celebration and a shop window for the sports car. Each year, hundreds of thousands of people make the pilgrimage to one of the most hallowed places in motor racing.
To see an old French city with men wearing blue coveralls and carrying bread under their arms on their bicycles with a little cigarette hanging out of their mouth, it was just an enormous cultural shock, I guess, for me. And our hotel was right next to the railroad station, and there were these strange machines with steam making coffee, and the whole thing was like a different world.
The historic circuit has been used since the 1920s. Generations of drivers have learnt the famous corners, Arnage, the S's, Tête Rouge. A link with the past is the Mulsanne Straight, a public road closed each year for the race.
There were 2 or 3 corners which were tricky, and you used all the roads, so it was quite challenging. It wasn't a fatiguing circuit, because you've got the Mulsanne Straight where you could sit back and let it, you know, have its head. The burning thing in my life had been to drive at Le Mans. Unlike many of the Grand Prix drivers, I actually liked it. I enjoyed getting in a car and just driving and driving, you know, going on and on and on. To me, that was fun.
And it still goes on, day and night.
I love the night driving at Le Mans. It's very, very exhilarating. Not so much now we've got these stupid new chicanes they put in, but certainly on the old straight, it was wonderful to go down that straight at 230 and you just look up and see the stars and everything. It was wonderful. You know, you can't explain it to people that it can be romantic driving 230 miles an hour. Most people think it's a white-knuckle ride. You're looking so far ahead out the windscreen that the sky meets your horizon, so you're just looking out and you can see the stars just like that. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful experience.
It wasn't so wonderful in an open car when it rained.
I'd already done several wet runs,
And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'd run out of sort of dry socks, dry pants, dry vests, etc. And I had to pull on, wet vests, wet socks, wet underpants at 3 o'clock in the morning and go out and drive a motor car in a race that I really wasn't interested in. And I thought, well, if I ever do this again, I really need to be certified. And I didn't drive again.
Jaguar took the XK122 Le Mans in 1950, but they could manage only 12th and 15th places. For 1951, they built a new car, the C-Type, specially for the race. Jaguar knew they had the potential to win.
We realised that none of our competitors had a modern motor car. Nobody had a really up-to-date motor car. Nobody had an aerodynamically shaped motor car. And we reckon if we just produced a lighter motor car with an aerodynamic shape using our virtually standard engine gearbox axle units, we had a chance of winning the next year.
The C-Type won in 1951. In 1953, Jaguar were among the first to fit disc brakes.
At Le Mans, any car with drum brakes must nurse the brakes to get to the end. And the Jaguars could afford to brake at the last moment from the beginning to the end of the race.
The C-Types came first, second and third. In 1952, Mercedes came into sports car racing with the now legendary 300 SL. It made an instant impact on the racetrack. Mercedes went on to make a huge investment in racing. Under their equally legendary manager Alfred Neubauer, they were always the team which others had to try very hard to beat. Their engineering excellence was renowned, so was their organization. With the best drivers, they became formidable opponents.
Mercedes were, in my mind, certainly in my era, the greatest team in the world. They have the name, they have the history, they have the cars, they have the mechanics. I drove for Mercedes in 1955, and having finished the year, I rather felt if I'd said